Okay, so let's do an itty-bitty tutorial on how to head track in Star Citizen or basically any other flight simulator game that actually enables it. And for those who don't know, head tracking is something that has been done for quite a long time, and it's a feature that is actually like quite useful in simulation games like Star Citizen. But the way it works is usually it will either look at your face and track the orientation of where your eyes and nose are, or it will use something like an IR tracker, which are 3 dots in separate locations on the side of your headphones or headset or whatever. And an IR camera will keep constantly looking at you with a really high refresh rate, and that will send the tracking data as it calculates to the game, allowing you to slightly turn your head, which will translate into a much bigger movement in game, allowing you to look around. Now, in our case, we're going to be using something called OpenTrack right here. You can download OpenTrack off of GitHub. Just search up OpenTrack on Google or Bing, and it should pop up. And for us nerds, considered we all have VR headsets, and most of us even have Vive trackers, this is a way to translate our data from VR into head tracking data for other games. Now, the way it will work is we're going to go ahead and start SteamVR. Now, while this is launching, I'll explain how my setup works. I have a really old baseball cap that I picked up a long time ago, and it is ugly and a sin, but on the back of the baseball cap is a Velcro strap, and to that strap I tied a Vive Puck, so it's sitting directly on the back of my head. I just use some, you can use some zip ties, I use some other like Velcro strips I had for cable management, and I tied it to the back of the head strap, put the hat on, and put the headphones over the hat. So it's nice and stable, it's not very heavy, and it's just kind of chilling out on the back of my head, and it's very comfortable to sit with, to me. So now that SteamVR has launched, I'm only using one base station. You can use both. This works great with both, but due to the setup and the location in my room, I don't actually need to use both base stations because the base station that it's using right now is staring right at the back of my head. So that's perfect. We're going to open up OpenTrack, and we're going to set some things up. One, in the input section, you can see there's a lot of different ways to do it, including Oculus. You can use a original Rift with this if you really wanted to, but for the time being, we're not going to use any of these except for Valve SteamVR. In Valve SteamVR, as we have VR launched, we're going to click on the little hammer icon on the side of it, and we're going to select our Vive tracker. You can use a controller for this, or you can even put the entire headset on your head if you really wanted to. And I've seen some people do a 3-screen setup in VR, and like basically fully immersive, like cockpit setup kind of thing. You've seen them on the internet, and they would throw the game onto those 3 screens, and they would use their headset itself that they're already wearing to look at those screens to send tracking data to the game, and that would allow them to move their head a little bit and rotate it in the game. And it's a whole complicated setup. You don't need to worry about it. For now, we're just going to select our Vive Pro tracker and press OK. Now in here, there's a couple of things that we want to do. One, we want to go into options, and we want to buy a toggle tracking button. I set mine to Control-Alt-Insert. You can set yours to whatever you want, including a mouse button. This is a pretty important keybind because this is how we center our trackers and how we turn our tracking on and off. And then in outputs, I disabled roll because I don't want to be rolling my head. I want to be able to look up, down, left, and right, and that's it. I don't need that extreme of tracking. But for this, we're going to try it with roll and see what it does. It will also allow me to show you how to do mapping. So if you go to mapping, the way mapping works is you have a curve, and the maximum amount of degrees that your head will rotate, that's going to be on the x-axis, and on the y-axis it's how many degrees that will be translated to in the game. For example, we have raw tracking data and we have our game data. So if I start tracking, you can see these are my raw numbers. And as I yaw, just look left and right, it goes from negative 20 degrees to 20 degrees, right? But for the game, when I yaw, it does a full negative 122 degrees, and the other way, full 180 degrees as I hit 25 degrees in yaw for our real tracking. So that means that when I move my head, I only move my head about 20 degrees to the left or to the right in order for it to translate to the tracking data, to translate to a much larger impact in the game. So how do we set this up? We set this up by setting a max input. So on both pitch, yaw, and roll, you will have a maximum input, so you can either do 180 degrees. I recommend keeping these numbers fairly low, but within comfort range. At 45 degrees, you have to look from the center of your monitor, depending how far it is, 45 degrees to the left or to the right, so almost all the way to the bezel, if not more, in order to have the rotation hit its maximum output of 180 degrees. So you want to lower it down so you're still looking at the monitor and you're comfortably just rolling your eyes a little bit in order to reach the maximum output. And if you really need the maximum output, that's when you like kind of strain yourself a little bit, but in most cases you won't need to do that. I realized for yaw and pitch, they should be different because I don't want to be looking up too much. So yaw I keep at around 25 degrees, and pitch I keep at 20 degrees. Now, as for the Bezier curve, what does that do? So the Bezier curve defines how much of an impact you will have based on how many degrees you've rotated. So normally, when we're playing normally, and I'll show you how to set these up. When we're playing normally, if I rotate my head, it will linearly translate to how much I want to actually rotate the octopus, basically 1-to-1. At 25 degrees, it's going to be 80 degrees. At 10 degrees, we're going to be around like 70 degrees. It's perfect 1-to-1 to the scale. But honestly, with small movements, maybe I want a little bit, less acceleration. Maybe I want it to be a little smoother. So what I would do is I would set the first point and I would drag it out all the way to the corner to make it linear. And now I will use the knowledge of Bezier curves if you ever played around with something like Photoshop. And I will click again and create another curve. So now when we hit 11 degrees, instead of being where it was, which is 80 degrees of rotation, it will only do 40 degrees of rotation. So as I yaw at 11 degrees, we do 11. And if we delete this, we can see we're rotated a lot more by 11 degrees. And this just smooths out the motion. This is something you can play around with and actually try out for yourself how you like it. There's also going to be in-game settings and stuff like that. But for the time being, this is kind of all you need to know for this, which is your max input, what your smoothness curve is going to look like basically, and that's about it, and how many degrees it's going to rotate in total. So hopefully that makes more sense to what I originally explained. Once we're done here, we can hit start tracking, and as you can see, the little octopus now, as I move my head around, will follow where I'm looking, except a little faster because I don't want to rotate my head too far. Right? And it will also do roll. As you can see, as I roll my head left and right, like you would do for like cracking your neck or whatever, it will wiggle with me. And I believe roll will need to get mirrored. So if we go to options, output, and we invert roll, Now the octopus is following me, following exactly where I'm looking. Up, down, left, right, roll left, roll right. And for the sake of argument, we can try to get into Star Citizen and see what that looks like in game real quick. Now, if you ever end up out of binding, so if you stop tracking and start tracking here, you can see that like everything's like wonky. Start directly in the center of your screen and start tracking again, and that will recenter everything. This is where the control alt insert key binding comes in pretty handy. So let's go ahead and wait for Star Citizen to launch, hopefully sooner rather than later. And we'll be right back once that's done. Okay, so we're in Star Citizen and we are gonna go into settings, comms, VoIP, and head tracking. In head tracking, we're gonna go ahead and we are gonna select our source, and our source is going to be TrackIR. Now, obviously we're not using TrackIR, but we're outputting to the same area as TrackIR, so that's why TrackIR. We're also gonna go ahead and toggle tracking in game. And there's a bunch of options that you can customize here to your heart's content if you want to really dial it in. But for the time being, we're just going to turn it on in game. And we are here in Arena Commander. And as you can see, we can look around and we can look up and down. And there's our head tracking. And I think this is probably the best way to do this if you don't want to spend $100 and some on TrackIR, or like almost $300 on Nolo Tracker to get head tracking working if you already have a VR headset. And I can look up and down and I can stare at my enemies while I'm flying my ship, and it works pretty good. So I can look at the station. I'm doing my maneuvers, and it works pretty great. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this is useful or helpful. And yeah, peace.